Hi, welcome to the channel. So as a former Army combat medic, I thought it would be interesting to react to Wounded on the Western Front, a death sentence, coming from the channel Battle Guide. Let's get to it.
By late 1914, the effects of industrial warfare had become all too apparent on the battlefields of the Western Front. A potent mix of heavy artillery, high explosives, machine guns, barbed wire, colossal mines, and deadly gas all contributed significantly to extraordinarily high casualty rates.
Just FYI, that was the Hawthorne Mine at the Battle of the Somme on the first day. It went off at 7:20 a.m., 10 minutes before the main offensive actually began.
In short, there were many ways to die on the battlefield. But casualty rates are not just about the men who were killed. They also include those who were wounded, missing, or prisoners of war. Of more than 5.4 million British and Empire servicemen who saw action along the 440-mile Western Front, it's well recognised that close to 850,000 were known to have been killed, many of whom still have no known grave. But what is often forgotten is the plight of the wounded. Over 2.5 million British servicemen alone were wounded between August 1914 and November 1918 in France and Flanders. But only around 150,000 died in the medical evacuation chain. So how did so many survive? In this video, we'll explore the experience, evacuation and treatment of the wounded with a focus on one of the most challenging days of the war, 1st of July 1916, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. First off, what type of injuries are we talking about and what caused them? Some very useful statistics exist which give us a clear insight into those numbers. Focusing exclusively for a moment on traumatic battle injuries and not accidents or illness or gas casualties, which is the subject of its own video, comparative statistics tell us that the most common cause of injury sustained on the battlefields of the Western Front was from artillery, i.e. shell splinter or shrapnel wounds, including those caused by trench mortars, accounting for a huge 59% of all documented wounds. The next most numerous, at 39% of the total, were bullet wounds from machine guns, sniper and rifle fire. Beyond that, at only 2% were hand-thrown bombs and grenades, and then finally accounting for less than 1% of all battle casualties were edged weapons, including bayonets, swords and lances. It's worth pointing out here that these weapons were not necessarily responsible for a similar proportion of deaths. For example, grenades and edge weapons, which by their nature were used in very close proximity to the enemy, and thus in locations where evacuation was more difficult, tended to result in a higher ratio of death to wounds when compared to shrapnel or shell splinter wounds, which could be inflicted miles behind the lines, often close to existing medical facilities. But what about the location of injuries? Well, that makes an interesting examination too. According to surviving medical records, 39.3% of all non-fatal wounds occurred in the feet or legs, 31% in the hand or arms, 17.1% in the head, neck or face, 6.5% in the back, just 3.9% in the chest, and finally only 2.3% in the abdomen, with a huge 79.3% being classified as flesh wounds. These somewhat surprising numbers do beg the question of why there were so relatively few chest and abdominal wounds. Part of that answer could be found in the way artillery tends to burst, i.e. above the target. When combining that with the natural tendency to raise one's arms as protection, along with the knowledge that abdominal, chest and back wounds were very likely to prove fatal and so not feature here, it makes a little more sense. Likewise, high rates of wounding in the legs can in part be accounted for by artillery striking men lying down, and it should also be remembered that machine guns were trained to aim low, which also resulted in lots of lower body wounds. In response to the massive casualties seen throughout 1915 and 16, not only did the Royal Army Medical Corps, the unit responsible for casualty treatment and evacuation, have to exponentially increase in size from its pre-war establishment, but it also had to evolve to deal with numerous new types of injuries and wounds on the battlefield.
It wasn't just the medical corps that needed more men for the war. The entire British army was actually a small army and was nothing compared to Germany and France, because traditionally the British army has always been small and made up of career soldiers. So when the war began, over 2 million men and boys actually volunteered, and obviously that did help strengthen up the medical corps.
That said, by the time of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the RAMC had a very well developed medical evacuation chain to allow sick and wounded men to be quickly moved from point of injury to a position where appropriate medical treatment could be administered.
That is called the golden hour. It's a 60-minute window from the moment you are injured until the moment you arrive at the next level of care. If you can arrive at the next level of care within 60 minutes, then you have a much higher likelihood of survival.
And that's the key. The survival of a casualty depends on the speed at which treatment could be given, and even today we refer to a golden hour within which this needs to happen. In fact, as we'll see, there are many comparisons that could be drawn from the First World War casualty evacuation chain to the treatment which we would receive today if injured. So how exactly did the process work? Well, first of all, it really depended on what was happening at the time. Even in a quiet sector and standing in a trench, injuries could be received during an impromptu artillery barrage, a chance sniper's bullet, or from general accidents. The advantage of being in a trench would be that the soldier in question was likely to receive immediate assistance from their comrades and the battalion medical team who would be on hand to deal with injuries. Let's also not forget that in a trench, the casualty and the people treating them had a great deal of protection from further fire. However, during a major offensive, and that's what we'll focus on, things were very different when battalions were ordered over the top, and there can be few other periods in the First World War where British medical services were challenged so much as the first day of the Somme.
So just to give you an idea of how much pressure was on the medical teams during the Somme, specifically on the first day, I'm going to give you guys some quick numbers. On the first day, over 57,000 casualties, with 19,000 of those actually being killed, which means 38,000 wounded or captured. In the first hour alone, there were 30,000 casualties, 500 casualties every minute.
We're dropping down into Beaumont-Hamel on the Somme. It's the morning of the 1st of July 1916, and we're over the front line where the 1st Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers were preparing to attack strong enemy positions along this tree line some 350 yards away. Many of those men would actually be captured on film by British cinematographer Geoffrey Malins in trenches or in the famous Sunken Lane film scene at around 6:30 am, the location of which has hardly changed over the last century. For those men captured here, the wait was relatively short. At 7:20 am, the air was split with an almighty roar of the Hawthorne Redoubt mine exploding to their right, it too being caught on film. And at 7:30 am, the whistles blew and they were over the top, stepping into a murderous enemy machine gun fire. Pre-battle operational orders clearly stipulated that if men were hit, then comrades were not allowed to stop, on the threat of court-martial.
So it sounds cruel not to help your battle buddy after he's been shot in the middle of an advance, but by today's standard in the U.S. Army, we preach the same exact thing. Unless you have fire superiority, you do not go help your wounded battle buddy, because then you will probably get hit as well. That is a part of the care under fire phase of Tactical Combat Casualty Care, or TC3, that the U.S. Army actually uses.
And whilst brutal, this makes sense. The role of the infantry taking part in an attack would have been to secure an enemy position. Stopping in no man's land to help a comrade would mean less men in the assault, and it would also provide an easy target, and now in all likelihood there will be 2 casualties rather than 1. Let's say that someone had been wounded in no man's land. It may have been possible for them to treat themselves to begin with. Each soldier had a basic first field dressing, which consisted of 2 sterile bandage pads, one for the entry and another for the exit wound. Depending on how severely they were injured, they may have been lucky enough to be able to make their way back to the comparative safety of the sunken lane. But if that wound was more serious, for example a shattered leg, which completely immobilized them, then they would now be relying on the battalion's stretcher bearers to get them. These brave men followed the attack waves and will pick up the wounded, as one man recalled.
Every soldier in the U.S. Army is issued an IFAC, or an improved first aid kit, which has basic first aid supplies such as an emergency trauma dressing, an occlusive dressing, an NCD pen, and a tourniquet. I don't have one in the office. I have mine in storage, but depending on your command's guidance, you would put your first aid kit somewhere on your body armor. That way, if you got injured, either you or one of your battle buddies could use your first aid kit to save your life. And under no circumstances do you ever use your first aid kit to treat anyone. And one more thing to note, do you see the bags that are hanging around the necks of all those medics? I'm almost positive that they have their NBC or gas mask in there.
You might be coming down from the front line and suddenly you hear a mournful cry from a bush perhaps 20 yards away. Stretcher bearers, and all you could do was ease your stretcher down on the ground for a moment, go over and see to the case, give them an injection if necessary or some tablets to ease the pain, and tell them you'd come back. Early on in the war, stretcher bearers would have been just that, and not really given training providing anything more than basic first aid. But by the time of the Battle of the Somme, battalion stretcher bearers, often members of the battalion's band when not in action, had started to develop skills such as applying tourniquet to stop major bleeding and administering basic pain relief, giving a man a better chance of survival. It would have been a strenuous job for any unarmed stretcher bearer with 2, 4, or even more men needed to carry a person back to friendly lines, often under relentless fire from German machine guns and artillery.
So I've done lots of litter obstacle courses and litter training, especially during medic school, and let me tell you right now just how exhausting it is carrying a litter for a distance. I couldn't imagine having to evacuate a 180 or 200 pound patient over rough terrain going 200, 300, 400 yards in no man's land under fire. I think a lot of times they only had 2 medics per stretcher, but even if they had 4, it is still one of the most exhausting tasks you could imagine.
On days like the 1st of July 1916, we saw over 59,000 casualties across a 12-mile front. It may well have been nightfall or days before a casualty could be recovered. In many ways, the stretcher bearers of 1916 can be compared to the paramedics of today, offering life-saving treatment and transporting the casualty back to further help. Whether men were walking wounded or carried back on a stretcher, invariably the first place they would be taken would be the Regimental Aid Post, under the direction of the Regimental Medical Officer, or RMO, who would have generally been a qualified doctor. Consider him to have been the battalion's general practitioner. In day-to-day life in the trenches, he would be one to treat your cut hand or trench foot and ensure the sanitation was adequate.
So that would be equivalent to a U.S. Army battalion aid station, which is manned by medics and a physician assistant or PA. Generally speaking, you usually will not see doctors at that level.
But during a planned offensive, he and his small team would have been as close to the frontline trenches as possible, usually near the battalion headquarters. We know that on the 1st of July 1916, the RAP for the 1st Lancashire Fusiliers was here in the trench area named White City for its chalky banks. More specifically in a place called the Tenderloin, using deep dugouts about 200 yards back from the sunken lane. So you can see how far the initial stretcher carry wouldn't have needed to be. In fact, Geoffrey Maylands actually captured stretcher bearers of the Lancashire Fusiliers bringing in wounded from no man's land on that very morning in this powerful footage. The regimental medical officer's main job was to stop bleeding, change dressings, and probably give an anti-tetanus as well as morphine injections to make the man more comfortable, with the aim to stabilise them for onward evacuation back down the line. Iodine and carbolic acid would be used to help prevent infection getting into any open wound. In this case, for someone with a leg fracture, the most valuable piece of equipment adopted in the war which could be found at the regimental aid post was the Thomas splint. When fitted to a casualty's leg and traction applied, it would immobilise leg fractures, preventing further internal damage and bleeding, which very often led to death.
So obviously they have evolved a lot in the last 100 years or so, but traction splints are still used with femur fractures today.
It saved countless lives. But water was also a vital requirement on the first day of the Somme. It was an extremely hot day and rehydration of the wounded was essential, and therefore the regimental aid post was normally to have been found close to the battalion's water supplies. So with a drink to limit dehydration and the worst of the bleeding stopped, it was time to move on. Remember that the RAP is still within easy reach of enemy fire, so evacuation would have had to be by stretcher at this stage, with most men being moved away from White City along a trench called 3rd Avenue. With the stretcher bearers struggling along a congested trench against the flow of reinforcements moving up the line. The casualty would have next entered one of the 29th Division's 3 field ambulances in this area. But don't confuse this term with the motorised variety. Consider a field ambulance to be a large medical team of 10 officers and 224 men with the transportation and infrastructure to deliver an injured person down a corridor from the front line to better medical facilities.
If memory serves, British General Rawlinson actually had about 18 of those units stationed at the Somme on July 1st.
Each field ambulance had 108 stretcher bearers to deal with large numbers of casualties and provision to support walking wounded as well. A number of bearer relay posts would have been established with men organised so that they could relay the wounded shorter distances to minimise the inevitable exhaustion. With a little more medical expertise than battalion stretcher bearers, field ambulance unit personnel would also make simple but significant contributions. Offering a cigarette and a mouthful of tea to a wounded man was seen as a key preventative against the lethal effects of shock. The first and most important position in the field ambulance journey was an advanced dressing station, or ADS. This is really the equivalent of an emergency department in a modern hospital. There were 2 ADSs set up for the left flank of the 29th Division on the 1st of July 1916, at Auchanvillers and Mailly-Maillet. We'll jump to the one at Auchanvillers now so you can see the relative distance needed to be covered in this move. Doctors here would quickly triage casualties, provide immediate treatment to those who needed it, and prepare the wounded for onward transfer further behind the line. But what exactly was triage? It was perhaps the essential feature of the medical evacuation process. All casualties were assessed on the severity of their wounds, how stable they were, and how likely their chances of survival. With more than 4 in 5 of the Lancashire Fusiliers to attack that morning becoming casualties, a tough decision had to be made. Who got the first treatment? That meant roughly categorising the wounded into 3 groups: will live, won't live, might live.
So the U.S. Army equivalent would be a level 2 aid station. You would get triaged, and then you would actually see a PA or a doc. And for modern day battlefields, level 2 has x-ray, lab, dental, and patient hold capabilities. But the U.S. Army's system of triage is called IDME or DIME, delayed, immediate, minimal, and expectant. Delayed just means that a patient might have a serious injury, but waiting for treatment will not cause disability or death. An example would be a fractured arm with controlled bleeding. Immediate means if they don't get immediate care, they will die. Examples would be a sucking chest wound or arterial bleeding from a limb. Minimal is the lowest priority of all the patients. They are the walking wounded. Examples would be a minor laceration or a sprained ankle. And the final category is expectant, which means even with advanced medical care, these people will most likely die, which is why very little resources are actually directed at them. Instead, you want to use those resources on patients that can actually be saved. An example of that would be a soldier who had brain matter exposed.
For those in the first group, the will lives, who were suffering painful but non-life-threatening injuries, it was often a case of making their own way back to the nearest aid station as walking wounded. Those in the second group, the won't lives, were sadly not the priority either, often suffering catastrophic and clearly unsurvivable wounds, a strong dose of morphine, a quiet prayer from the battalion chaplain, and being moved to an out-of-the-way spot might be all that could be done for moribund men, as they became known.
For the U.S. Army, our expectant patients are also moved out of the way and out of view, but they're never left alone. There's always at least one medic there who can provide comfort and palliative care.
The priority lay with the third group, the might lives. It was these men for whom time was of the essence. Prompt and professional medical care might be the difference between life and death. Getting these men back for further help was vital.
So these are the immediate patients.
It was also at this stage that the essential wound cleaning needed to take place. Make no mistake, infection in the First World War was a huge killer. Earlier in the war, contaminated soft tissue wounds were sterilised by using carbolic acid or iodine, which could also damage the healthy tissue and had poor results. Up to 80% of the wounded could have been infected with the deadly gas gangrene bacteria. However, during the Battle of the Somme, a new technique, devised by the French surgeon Alexis Carrel and British chemist Henry Dakin, was first used to irrigate wounds by continuously passing sodium hypochlorite into it until clear of infection. The
Sodium hypochlorite, that's a bleach. Dakin's solution. We actually used that in Iraq on these horribly burnt patients which had some infections such as, I think, Pseudomonas? I don't remember, but even now it is still used.
Carrel-Dakin method, as it became known, reduced the effect of infection in victims to an astounding 20% and led to the saving of many lives. Back in the evacuation chain, to avoid unnecessary congestion, walking wounded would normally be directed to a separate collecting point at this time. This was vital to ensure that the casualties most at risk could be dealt with first, stabilised and then moved on. But Auchanvillers Military Cemetery today tells the tale of those who didn't make it. Over 60 men died in or near this advanced dressing station in the first few days of July, including 5 from the First Lancs Fusiliers. One of them was this man, Corporal Thomas Farrell, aged 29, a former Manchester City footballer who is today buried next to the Cross of Sacrifice.
What is the Cross of Sacrifice?
For those lucky enough to have survived so far, their next journey could have been in an ambulance motor convoy. But there was also a trench tramway running from Auchanvillers through Mailly to the 87th Field Ambulance main dressing station at Ercheux, about 3 miles to the west. Although some men from this sector may have been taken to Louvencourt, a little further north. A main dressing station was a focal point where the evacuation chains of other divisional field ambulances could come together to form a major medical hub. The MDS performed the same tasks as an ADS, but had more resources and capacity for dealing with wounded men. Once again, you will be triaged, given emergency surgical treatment and assessed for suitability for onward movement, pronounced moribund, or patched up and returned to the front.
Surgical capabilities would be at a level 3, which would be a combat support hospital or a CASH, and that is where I worked when I was in Baghdad.
But considering the number of casualties being funneled into this area, the main objective was always to keep the flow of wounded troops moving on to the next stop. For those still living, that was the casualty clearing station. CCSs, called clearing hospitals up until 1915, provided greater capability for medical treatment and in many ways looked like individual specialist departments within modern hospitals. These were static sites located maybe 6 miles back, and they came under the control of an army operating on that front. 15 CCSs were allocated to the area for the Battle of the Somme, and each was equipped for around 200 seriously wounded and 800 lesser casualties, and some would be specialised for particular injuries, meaning that all men with penetrating abdominal injuries would in theory be sent to the same CCS, which would be manned by a medical team whose expertise was dealing with that particular type of wound. We know that one of 3 casualty clearing stations in the area was number 29 CCS, located near the chateau at Gigencourt. So this meant another ride in an ambulance or light railway carriage from the MDS at Ercheux. Being static meant that a CCS had more permanent buildings which could be used for operating theatres and wards as well as the usual tentage. CCSs had similar functions to all other previous posts, to receive and treat the more critically wounded until fit for onward transfer to more established base hospitals near the coast, or again retain those that might be fit for an early return to duty. This was also the first time a soldier would have likely seen a nurse, as it was usually the closest to the front line that they would be posted. Over 10,000 nurses of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service and 8,000 from the Territorial Force Nursing Service served on the Western Front, and their experiences were often unimaginable in a major offensive, as nurse Edith Appleton confided to her diary. Wounded, hundreds upon hundreds on stretchers, being carried, walking, covered from head to foot in well-caked mud. The rush and buzz of ambulances and motor buses is the only thing I can remember of yesterday. Horribly bad wounds, some crawling with maggots, some stinking and tense with gangrene. One poor lad had both eyes shot through, and they were there lying all smashed up, mixed in with the eyelashes. He was quite calm and very tired. He said, "Shall I need an operation? I can't see anything." Poor boy, he never will. The casualty clearing stations at Regimental were, like many, sited next to a railway line or sidings. This gave an opportunity for relatively large numbers of wounded to be transported onwards by dedicated ambulance trains, or, as in this case, hospital barges, thanks to access to the river Orty at Doulon. Barges were especially welcome as a method for moving men with wounds required to be kept completely immobile. The final leg of the journey in France will be to a stationary or general hospital in one of the base areas, each of which normally had over 1,000 beds for wounded and sick soldiers and would have looked much like a modern hospital. Facilities would have included advanced surgical wards, x-ray machines, and by 1916 even blood transfusion techniques had been introduced. At the time of the Battle of the Somme, the British hospital system was put under crisis expansion, and wounded would have been sent to any one of a number of sites on the coast like Calais, Étampes, Boulogne, Le Havre, or Rouen. In all, there were 58 British, Dominion, and voluntary hospitals available in July 1916. The largest concentration, 12 in total, were to be found here at Étampes, known to Tommies as Eat-Apples, many of which specialised for serious wounds such as abdominal, head and gas injuries, isolation hospitals for transmittable diseases, and convalescent homes for the less seriously wounded. Soldiers would also be cared for by voluntary aid detachment nurses here. For those men successfully reaching a base hospital, there was a huge element of luck involved in the chance of survival. The very first man to be wounded at 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916 would have had access to the first stretcher bearers, the first ambulance, the first train back, and the first medical team at the base hospital, which he could have reached in a matter of hours. On the other hand, the 50,000th man to have been wounded may have taken 4 or 5 days to make the same journey, often with fatal consequences. Most of those who could not be saved today lie here, at Étampes Military Cemetery. It contains over 10,700 Commonwealth service personnel. Amongst them, my own great-great-grandfather, who, wounded at the Battle of Arras in 1917, made it this far, but no further.
That's sad. There's some larger cemeteries such as that, but then there's lots of smaller cemeteries as well, because many of the soldiers were buried where they fell.
Despite being out of range to all but the heaviest enemy guns, staff at base hospitals were not immune to the dangers of war. St John's Hospital and a number of others in the Étampes area were bombed in late May 1918, and one notable grave in the same cemetery is that of nursing sister Catherine Maud Mary MacDonald from Ontario, who died as a result of an attack on No. 1 Canadian General Hospital. Despite the size of the cemetery at Étampes, the chances of living for a casualty would have increased significantly by now, with more than 95% of those arriving at base hospital surviving the experience. Contrary to popular belief, not every wound was a blighty one, slang for a wound serious enough to get you sent home to Britain. Almost 600,000 wounded men were returned to duty from the evacuation chain without ever being sent back to the UK. Between the 3rd and 6th of July 1916, over 47,500 sick and wounded men were taken home by hospital ships to Britain through the ports of Dover and Southampton. By the end of the month, this figure had reached 121,000, a phenomenal number to deal with. Each casualty would have been transferred by train or ambulance to a multitude of central sites like Netley Hospital in Hampshire, or one of hundreds of auxiliary and convalescent hospitals located across the United Kingdom, often in requisitioned manors and stately homes. Convoys would arrive at one of these hospitals at any time of day or night, but the task would have been the same at each location. Further stabilise the patient, carry out the necessary, often specialised medical treatment, establish a plan of recovery, and in time decide whether they could return to duty on the front line or only were fit to take on jobs at home. Thousands were invalided out of the service after review by medical board and would often require long-term physical or psychological care well beyond the war years. A story not unfamiliar to many of us with family members who fought on the Western Front. All told, over the course of the Great War, the often unsung heroes of the medical services helped evacuate and save the lives of millions of wounded soldiers. In a war of attrition, this was vital in sustaining fighting strength, and of course we shouldn't forget that the French, Russians, Germans and all belligerents experienced the very same challenges in evacuating and saving their own wounded. It's been estimated that with the British alone, 109 million bandages were used during the war, enough to wrap 14 times around the earth. but sadly not enough to ensure that the grim routes out of the battle zones, including that from the Somme, are still marked today by hundreds of cemeteries where many thousands perished in the evacuation process, remain to this day.
Just to give you an idea of the scope, but there are roughly 450 British Commonwealth memorials and cemeteries scattered all over. And as you can see, many of the cemeteries are actually pretty close to each other, with some only maybe 40 or 50 yards apart.
If you'd like to know more about the First World War, why not check out our dedicated look at gas warfare on the Western Front right here on YouTube. And that's all this time. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you guys so much for watching. It was very interesting to see that battlefield triage and evacuation has barely changed in the last 100 years. I'm not saying that we do things exactly the same as they did on the Somme, but it is very similar. If you do want a more in-depth video on this battle, once I film it, I'll put it right here. And if you want to hear a poignant and sad ballad about this battle, I'm going to put Motorhead's 1916 right here, and this will be Sabaton's cover of it, lest we forget.